This is my audio reading response for love poetry, specifically the poems we read Friday, March 18th. We're going to be discussing Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden, Habitation by Margaret Atwood, and When I Say That Loving Me is Kind of Like Being a Chicago Bulls Fan by Hanif Abdul Karib. So, the best way to discuss these three poems, because these three poems are unique when compared to the rest of the work that we've looked at this semester. That they kind of tie into each other, but they contrast in different ways. They're like different components of a same set, is the best way I can describe it. So, the best way to break down what these poems mean and what they represent and how they show love is going to be to summarize them, firstly, in terms of the kind of love that they display. So, we've discussed the 7 types of Greek love. We've discussed different love languages. Right now, we're going to focus on the 7 types of Greek love. And we'll start with Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden, which I think is a really fascinating poem because usually when a love is the focus of a poem, or lack of love is the focus of the poem, right? You'll have one of those two situations. And it's not just poetry. Usually, if it's about love, it'll be directly about love or lack of love. Whereas Those Winter Sundays, Hayden kind of writes about somebody, a son, presumably a son, reflecting on the love that his father had for him and his family, and how that love went unrequited. Um, and Those Winter Sundays is our first example here of one of the things that ties all three of these poems together, and that is um, really cold imagery, really depressing imagery. And it goes to lengths to, in those Winter Sundays, the cold imagery is used to try to make this feel depressing, make it feel upsetting. Whereas it's used differently in the other two poems, in my opinion. Um, this is supposed to make you feel longing or regret. Um, Especially, and the line that really gets me: when the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Um, it shows the speaker sort of lingering, sort of taking for granted the hard work that the father was doing in the cold of night to make sure that they could live safely. And it specifically uses the words slow, warm, which of course is a callback to how in the first line of that stanza it says, "I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking." Something has changed, and it's changed because of his father, but he takes that for granted. That right there, that middle stanza, really sums up the whole poem. The father working in awful conditions, dead of night, to make a life for his family, and the family not reciprocating that effort and love. This is like a storge love of a father for a son, unconditional. Despite the fact that it's unrequited, the father keeps doing it. It is a lack of that storge love in return too. Um, and that's the main type of love that is displayed. Of course, this poem discusses acts of service. The father would get up early and put his clothes on in the blue back cold, with crack hands that ached from labor, and the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. It's acts of service, is what it is. Um, and this one's really, really depressing. Which, when I'm going to go on and discuss habitation, uh, is in contrast to habitation, which is rather hopeful, in my opinion, poem. But it actually does line up well with when I say that loving me is kind of like being a Chicago Bulls fan by Hanif Abdurraqib. Um, that one's also it uses the imagery to make it cold, except to make it depressing. Except with when I say loving me is kind of like being a Chicago Bulls fan, it uses actually quite cheerful and warm imagery. Um, in that, so with that here, we'll move on to our next poem. 1 second. Just pull it up here so I can read excerpts from it. Habitation. Oh, and I really love this poem. Habitation's a fantastic little poem. Margaret Atwood, author of Handmaid's Tale, Canadian writer and poet, writes here about marriage, and she writes about um, the experience of marriage, and what on a deeper level marriage is. And it's worth actually just reading out the whole poem. That's how good this is. Marriage is not a house or even a tent. It is before that and colder. The edge of the forest, the edge of the desert, the unpainted stairs at the back where we squat outside eating popcorn, the edge of a receding glacier where painfully, and with wonder at having survived even this far, we are learning to make fire. This poem uses extraordinarily cold and barren imagery. You're in the wilderness. You're in danger. You know, these people are fighting. This is primeval. This is ancient. This is cavemen. And she's talking about marriage. She describes marriage as being cold, which at face value would make you think this is a really negative poem, but in reality, I think it's actually quite hopeful. It's very insightful, um, and it gives some really interesting insight into what the experience of marriage is like. Because for many people, you'll only do it once. You do it one time, and you do marriage, and you don't do it again. You're with that person until you die. For many people, um, so it's not like you get practice. And what habitation describes is that experience of just trying to figure it out, but with someone. And the end of the poem is really, really, really powerful because the end of the poem describes the chief type of love. There are two types of love in this poem, uh, but it describes the main type of love here, a pragma love, very committed, long-lasting love. You'll fight for the person you love, kind of situation. Um, and it establishes that in the final stanza, where painfully and with wonder at having survived even this far, we are learning to make fire. And it's the idea of we, two people, together as one unit, fighting to survive, trying to figure out how to do it, how to go through life. Which is why I think that this is actually a really beautiful picture of marriage, a really loving picture um, of marriage, rather than a very cold one. I think the the cold imagery is not used here to paint a bleak picture, but to paint a picture of a challenge, show that life isn't difficult, or sorry, to show that life is difficult, and then empower the idea of marriage by saying that it is beating those difficult challenges. That's what marriage is. Which is why I really enjoy this one. This is a really upbeat, I think, poem, even though it doesn't sound like it. It's the expansive imagery, the natural imagery is what gives it the power it has, and that outro there, that final stanza is very powerful. Um, painfully and with wonder, it all hits very well, and that's where the second, not so primary type of love, but it's still there, comes in, which is, I would argue, an agape, that selfless universal love, a kind of love for the world, for the experience of life. I think that's where that comes in. Not really much in terms of love language here because we're not talking about two specific individuals, but there's some quality time. Sitting on the back porch eating popcorn. There's some acts of service, making fire for one another, fighting for each other, surviving for one another. That's where this one lands. I think compared to the first one, this is a really wholesome picture of of a relationship between two people. Um, and of course, this one's in the well, it's not in the present, but it's not like somebody recalling something. So there's your main difference there. Third poem, we're discussing when I say that loving me is kind of like being a Chicago Bulls fan by Hanif Abdurraqib. Um, this poem is depressing to say the least. I think this poem is very very upsetting. um, and it's about this one's about a lack of love. You can compare it to the son's lack of love for his father in um those winter Sundays, in that there's a lack of love, but it's just a lack of love here. It's not like it's about an unrequited love. This is just a straight up lack of love, and it's a lack of self love. So now we're tackling something on a personal level, which makes it different. It sets it apart. And the sort of love that there is lacking here is, I mean, philautia, of course, and agape. A little bit of agape. The beautiful imagery, because there's a lot of good imagery in this one compared to the other two. There's a lot of warm imagery in this one, would suggest an agape, but at the same time, it's like, or a lack of agape, but at the same time, it's like maybe really not, because at the same time, there's cold imagery in it. Um, the poem is about a man who grows up the son of a family who are devoted followers of the Chicago Bulls basketball team. And when you're a follower of our sports teams like that, it carries a heavy emotional weight for you. And the story of the Bulls, according to Hanif, is sort of the story of his life. And that is that there was a time when the Bulls were great. The Bulls were towering. They were the best in the league. They had the best players. They had icons like Michael Jordan. And that time passed. And as the years rolled on and they did not recover that stature that they once had, it became harder and harder to bear. And it became a really depressing scenario to be a Chicago Bulls fan. For Hanif, he grew up a happy little boy with proud birthday parties, and he says that his dad can tell great stories about him back when he was a kid. He was happy. He was a normal, happy child. And some of the lines, there was a mountain of gold in the corner gathering dust where I used to, stuff like that. Where he talks about what he is, and it's him standing on a beach throwing rocks at the shoreline, and he's wearing rainbow swim shorts, and really happy imagery like that, all to tell the story of a past that is gone. And now he has lost the love for himself, and he's beat down, and people ask him what's up with him, and he doesn't know, and he doesn't know how to respond to them, and it makes him feel worse. Um, and he describes the passing of joy, how it gets worse and worse. And some of the lines at the end of the poem transition to very dumb, like dim, um, very very dim, dark imagery. He says he woke up one day and he was a still picture on the walls of everyone who used to love him. Um, he says, "I promise my legs just need another season, and I will be who you once fell in love with." I will say, what did he say? He said, I think he said, something along the lines of, "I will say that I'm sorry that there was once a tremendous blue sky, and now there's nothing left but a decade of incessant rain." And it gets really dark, and it's about a man who, like many, struggles with um, psychological issues. He's depressed. He's very clearly depressed, and he's completely lost his love for himself, and he describes it in such abnormal, unorthodox ways, which is what makes this poem stand out. He explains the feeling of being depressed with extraordinary proficiency, and he contains it into a semi-satire by tying it to the experience of being a fan of a sport team, and it's a very extraordinary piece of poetry. Um, and I guess if you're talking about love languages in this, it's kind of like anti-love languages that you have to discuss. He hates himself. It's the opposite of words of affirmation. There's a very dire situation, and I think that this poem's outlook is much bleaker than any of the rest of them, which is why it's so almost funny that the poem is the only one that uses happy imagery, like rainbow shorts standing on a beach throwing rocks at a shoreline, kind of bright daylight imagery. Um, it captures the different experiences of love very well. These three poems together capture these types of love very well, I think. It's kind of hard to capture in words, so you have to get creative, and they've certainly done that. The wording, the weight that each paragraph carried, and the way it built up, especially in Habitation, the way it builds up to a climax helps create that feeling. And I think that's why these three poems here are the best three that we ended up reading. And together, there's some of the best content that we've went over in this class in terms of the subject of love. Anyways, that was my reading response.